The mail-order bride never arrived. So the cowboy tracked the wagon wreckage and found her barely. The sun was sliding low across the plains when Silas Boone realized the stage was not coming. He stood at the edge of the road where dust usually announced travelers long before they arrived. But this evening, the only movement was the shimmer of heat rising off the earth. The horizon looked wide and empty, too quiet for comfort, too still for hope. A warm breeze slipped past him, carrying a faint rattling of dry grass, almost as if the land itself was whispering a warning. He kept watching anyway, refusing to move, feeling something tug at him, something he could not yet name. Silas had waited with the patience of a rancher who knew the world didn't bend simply because a man wished it to. Still, he'd been certain Clara May Hollister would step down from that wagon, with both hands clutching her traveling bag and her eyes trying to hide that same nervous courage he himself felt. He'd imagined her posture, her voice, the way she might offer a polite nod before searching his face to see whether the man she was meant to marry could be trusted. He had imagined so much that the absence of her shadow on the road felt like a blow he hadn't braced for. The quiet deepened around him, and a tiny thread of unease pulled tight in his chest. A door creaked from behind as Marla Granger leaned out of her shop, her apron fluttering. "Wagon should have passed noon," she called, her tone soaked in concern and something sharper, something that always came when people watched another man's luck fall short. "Maybe she changed your mind, Silas." Her voice softened after a breath. "Or maybe trouble found them on the trail." Silas didn't flinch at either possibility, but a coldness crawled slowly across his spine. He tipped his hat politely, though the words struck deeper than she knew. Marla retreated inside, leaving Silas with a rustle of fabric and the heavy quiet of unanswered questions. Deputy Wade Callahan approached soon after, riding slow, his horse kicking up small clouds of dust. "Heard the stage never reached Oak Hollow," he said. "Driver wasn't seen anywhere past the Split Canyon." His expression carried the kind of worry men didn't express unless they had no choice. Silas felt the ground shift beneath him, not literally, but in that way when a man realizes the story he expected might not be the one he's living. The deputy continued, "Some wagons come through late, but this ain't that kind of delay. Not with that stretch of land." Silas said nothing, just nodded once, the muscles along his jaw tightening. The deputy's gaze lingered. "If she's out there, she might be hurt." Silas exhaled slowly, and the world around him seemed to tilt toward danger. He walked to the hitching post, hand steady even as his chest tightened. His horse, Rusty, lifted its head as if sensing the tension in its owner. Silas saddled up without speaking, the leather creaking softly beneath his fingers. He slid his foot into the stirrup, glanced once more at the silent horizon, and rode toward the canyon trail. The townsfolk watched from porches and windows, some with sympathy, others with judgment, all with curiosity. Silas felt each gaze as he passed, but none weighed more heavily than the memory of Clara's last letter tucked in his coat pocket. She had written of hope, of leaving past bitterness behind, of trying again with someone who might understand quiet hearts. As Rusty carried him into the deepening dusk, Silas felt a strange dread twist with determination, and the question of what he might find grew heavier with each mile. The sun had nearly touched the canyon's edge when he reached the first sign of trouble. A scattering of broken boards lay half buried in dirt, a wheel track veering sharply, as though the wagon had swerved. Silas dismounted and crouched, letting his fingers graze the disturbed soil. The earth told story, panic, momentum, something forced off the trail too quickly. Further ahead, the wheel ruts disappeared where the land dipped into a rocky slope. Winds rushed through the canyon walls, sending echoes of distant creaking, almost like ghost wagon sounds drifting by mistake. Silas rose slowly, sensing he was close to something he wasn't ready for. He found the wagon minutes later, overturned near the mouth of a dry ravine. Its right wheel was shattered, spokes bent like ribs broken under a heavy blow. The canvas covering hung in tatters, snagged on juniper branches, flapping weakly in the evening wind. A small trunk lay cracked open against a boulder, women's dresses spilling out, torn and dust-covered. One pale blue ribbon clung stubbornly to a branch above, fluttering in the dying light. Silas lifted it gently, the fabric soft against his rough fingers. He knew it belonged to her. He didn't know how, but he knew. A shiver crawled up his arms, and he followed the footprints leading away from Wreckage. The prints were small, uneven, one foot dragging slightly, the pattern telling a tale of exhaustion and stubborn survival. Silas tracked them across the ravine, his boots crunching over loose stones. The sky deepened into ochre and violets, shadows stretching long and uncertain. He felt the air cooling as night approached, and the urgency in him sharpened. The wind shifted, carrying something faint, a hum, a breath, the suggestion of a voice. He paused, listening, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. Then he heard it again, a soft, brittle whisper carried by the breeze. He found Clara May leaning against a tall boulder, her hair tangled, her face streaked with dust and dry tears. Her dress was torn at the hem, her arms scraped raw, her lips pale but stubbornly pressed together. She looked up when he approached, eyes swollen yet startlingly bright, as if sheer willpower had kept her awake until help arrived. "Mr. Boone," she whispered, barely shaping the words. Silas knelt beside her, removing his coat and draping it over her shoulders, his hands gentle, his breath caught somewhere high in his chest. He had imagined their first meeting so differently. Still, something in this moment felt strangely fitting. Two battered souls paused in the middle of nowhere, watching each other with quiet astonishment. Clara tried to sit straighter, but her strength faltered. "I didn't know if anyone would come," she murmured. Silas met her gaze, his voice low and steady. "I came." He studied her carefully, not wanting to overwhelm her, but unable to hide the relief pouring through him. Clara flinched slightly when he touched her wrist to check for injury. The flinch wasn't fear of him, he realized. It was fear of needing someone's help. That understanding sank deep, settling like a quiet weight. She looked away, embarrassed, as though being vulnerable were a sin she had learned too young. Silas helped her rise, securing her against him. Her head rested briefly against his shoulder, warm and trembling, and something fragile inside him stirred. The ride back toward Boone Ranch unfolded beneath a sky turning indigo. Clara rested weakly against his chest, each breath she took brushing the fabric of his shirt. She apologized once softly, as if bracing for anger, but Silas silenced her with a gentle murmur, "You ain't a burden on a man who came looking for you." She didn't respond, not aloud, but her fingers curled slightly against the saddle horn, holding on as though she wasn't certain what belonging felt like. The prairie stretched around them, quiet and endless, and Silas felt every mile pulling them into something unexpected. He kept watching the land, but he also kept noticing the faint rise and fall of her breath, and each time he noticed, curiosity nudged him again. They reached the outskirts of town as lanterns flickered to life. The lights cast warm circles across the dusty street, illuminating the cluster of townsfolk who still lingered. Marla Granger stood near her shop doorway, her eyes widening at the sight of Clara leaning in Silas's hold. She whispered something to the man beside her, something Clara surely noticed, for her shoulders tensed beneath Silas's coat. Silas dismounted first, lifting Clara gently down. He positioned himself between her and the watching crowd, offering a silent shield. Clara glanced up at him, then really looked, and for the first time, her gaze softened with something like trust. That small shift made Silas feel unsteady in a way he didn't show. He guided her to the ranch house, his hand hovering near her back, but never forcing contact. Inside, he lit a lantern, the small flame casting amber light across the wooden walls. Shadows danced softly, warming the room with their flicker. Clara watched him as though unsure how to exist in such quiet kindness. Silas bandaged the scrape on her arm, his touch careful, respectful. She winced once, then quickly apologized for the reaction. "No need," he murmured, tying the cloth gently. "Pain's just truth showing itself." Clara released a shaky breath, studying him as if trying to decipher the kind of man who spoke like that. Silas looked down at her hand resting in his for balance, then released it slowly, almost reluctantly. She rose early the next morning, moving with the stiffness of someone unused to safety. She found Silas in the kitchen, already awake, fixing coffee with that thoughtful slowness he carried into everything. Clara approached timidly, offering to help, but her voice wavered. Silas stepped aside, letting her take the space without question. She poured the coffee, the scent filling the small kitchen, grounding them both. When she handed him a cup, her fingers brushed his, only for a second, but the touch made her inhale sharply, startled by the warmth that bloomed up her arm. Silas saw it, though he looked away politely, and whatever he felt remained unspoken but present. Later, he walked her to the porch, where morning air curled cool and gentle around them. Clara stood with her hands gripping the railing, as if the world might shift beneath her feet. Silas spoke softly beside her. "Clara, you don't owe me anything. Not marriage, not explanation, just honesty." She swallowed hard, her eyes fixed on the horizon she barely survived crossing. For a moment she said nothing, her breath trembling, her shoulders rising faintly with the weight of whatever truth she was holding back. Then she whispered, barely audible, "Honesty scares me more than the canyon trail did." She paused, tightening her grip on the railing, as if bracing for a storm inside her own chest, and Silas felt the first ripple of a deeper story waiting just beneath her trembling words. Silas didn't press her. The porch held a morning quiet that felt almost ceremonial, sunlight washing across the rails in pale gold. Clara's breathing steadied only after several long heartbeats, as though she had to borrow courage from the dawn itself. When she finally turned toward him, there was a fragility in her expression that made Silas stand still, not out of uncertainty, but out of respect. She spoke slowly, each word careful, as if she feared they might betray her if they came too fast. "I wasn't running from a life," she murmured. "I was running from the way people looked at me." Her eyes flickered downward, a shadow of old shame brushing her features before she caught herself. Something in her posture asked whether Silas would recoil, and the porch seemed to listen with him. Silas shifted his stance, grounding himself with a quiet nod. "You survived what the trail threw at you," he answered, "so I reckon you survived worse." She blinked at that, surprised that he understood without prying. Clara exhaled softly, releasing tension she'd held since the canyon. She stepped off the porch and began gathering her scattered belongings from the wagon trunk he had salvaged earlier. Silas joined her, sorting pieces with gentle hands. Their movements were wordless, yet something warm lingered between them, like the hush before a song finds its melody. Clara watched him carefully, still measuring the distance between obligation and affection, and that small uncertainty wound itself into Silas's thoughts. Throughout the day, Clara found herself tracking him with her eyes more than she intended. He moved through his chores with the dependable rhythm of a man who had lived half his life in solitude. When he repaired the fence, he worked in steady motions that eased her nerves rather than roused them. When he fed the livestock, his voice dropped into soft murmurs meant to calm the animals. Clara wondered whether he knew how rare such silence-filled kindness was. She wondered, too, if she could learn to trust it. Every time she approached him with a hesitant question, Silas answered in plain, patient words, never assuming, never belittling. The simplicity of it unsettled her more than cruelty ever had, because hope could be far scarier than hardship. Later that afternoon, Silas returned to the house with dust on his boots and a thoughtful crease across his brow. Clara stood by the table, folding a dress she had managed to repair. Her hands stilled when he entered, not out of fear, but because the room felt suddenly smaller with him in it. He hesitated before speaking, weighing his words like a man who didn't want to push too hard. "Clara, folks in town are talking." Her breath hitched, and she looked away, the old instinct rising fast, the one that told her to shrink before judgment arrived. Silas stepped closer, but not too close. "They're saying we ought to make the marriage official sooner, because of how you arrived. Hurt, stay in here with me." His voice was steady, but Clara heard the tension beneath it. "I didn't want you blindsided." Clara's fingers gripped the fabric in her hands until her knuckles whitened. She had known it would happen. Towns always talked, whispers turning into opinions, opinions turning into stories. She lifted her gaze, eyes shimmering with the weight of fear she hadn't yet named. "And what do you think?" she asked quietly. Her voice carried a quiver, but it also carried strength. Silas studied her for a long moment. The next words came from someplace deep within him, unpolished and honest. "I think you deserve choice," he said. "Not pressure, not gossip deciding your life for you." The fabric slipped from Clara's fingers as her breath unspooled in relief, though something unspoken still trembled inside her. Evening drew over the ranch with a warm, coppery glow. Silas lit the lanterns, their soft flames swaying as if stirred by invisible hands. Clara followed him outside, needing air, needing clarity. The prairie stretched wide, painted in broad strokes of amber and violet. Silas walked beside her, slow and steady, allowing silence to settle naturally. She felt the fragile edge of her own longing, something she hadn't dared acknowledge until now. "Silas," she said gently, "I came here ready to marry a stranger. I thought I understood what strength required." She paused, swallowing. "But surviving the trail, needing someone that shook everything I believed about myself." Her voice cracked, barely. "I don't want a marriage built on town demands." Silas turned to face her fully. The wind lifted a strand of her hair, brushing it across her cheek, and he resisted the sudden urge to tuck it back for her. "And I don't want a marriage built on fear," he replied, voice low. "But I won't lie, Clara. I don't think fate threw you from that wagon just to leave us standing in separate lives." His tone was gentle, but a quiet intensity shaped every word. Clara felt her pulse quicken, not from uncertainty, but from the raw truth in his voice. She opened her mouth to speak, but the sound of approaching riders sliced through the moment, carrying urgency on their thundering hooves. Deputy Callahan and 2 townsmen reined in sharply at the gate. The dust around them churned as they dismounted. Clara instinctively stepped closer to Silas, and he angled himself protectively without thinking. Callahan's expression was grave. "Silas, Clara, we found tracks near the canyon," he said. "Bandit tracks. Fresh." Clara's breath froze inside her chest, memories of the wagon's sudden crash flashing back with a violence she tried to bury. "You think they caused the wreck?" Silas asked, his voice sharpening. Callahan nodded. "Looks that way. And if they knew a woman survived, they might come looking to finish what they started." Clara's hand trembled against her skirts, and Silas noticed instantly. Silas led her inside, closing the door with deliberate calm. The lantern light cast soft halos around them, but the world outside felt suddenly darker. Clara leaned against the wall, breath unsteady. Silas moved slowly, as though approaching a wild, wounded creature, careful not to startle her, but unwilling to leave her alone. "You're safe here," he said quietly. She met his gaze, searching for certainty, and found it waiting for her. That steadiness soothed her trembling, though fear still coiled tight in her ribs. The bandits were no longer just a threat on the horizon. They were the shadow behind her memories. Silas saw that truth in her eyes, saw the moment she realized she might not outrun the past unless she stood with him. Night held its breath as they shared a silent moment near the kitchen table. Clara's hands fidgeted with the edge of the wood, her breaths shallow but measured. Silas stepped close enough that she could sense his warmth, though he didn't touch her. "Clara," he murmured, "we'll face whatever comes. But I need you to trust me." Her lashes fluttered, and she lifted her chin with trembling courage. "I do," she whispered. That single confession softened something inside him, something he'd kept locked away for years. Slowly, carefully, she reached for his hand. Her touch was feather-light, but the meaning behind it anchored them both. Silas's fingers curled around hers, hesitant yet sure. The night deepened. A gust of wind brushed through the cracks of the windows, stirring the lantern flame. Clara stepped closer, her breath brushing faintly across his throat, and Silas realized she was no longer shaking. She was choosing. She lifted her other hand to his cheek, gentle, reverent, testing whether kindness could be real. Silas leaned in slightly, a silent promise passing between them. When their lips met, it wasn't a desperate kiss, but a slow, fragile merging of two lives that had been wandering alone for far too long. Clara exhaled against him, and Silas held her waist with a careful tenderness that made her feel wanted, not claimed. The kiss was quiet yet monumental, the kind that changed the rhythm of a life. They parted only when breath demanded it, foreheads resting together, silence pulsing with new certainty. Clara felt warmth flood her chest where fear had lived moments before. Silas brushed a thumb softly across her cheek, and she let her eyes drift closed, letting the safety of him settle into her bones. Before she could speak, a sharp crash echoed from outside, wood splitting under force. Clara jolted, and Silas steadied her immediately, guiding her behind him as he reached for the rifle by the door. "Stay low," he whispered, voice steady but edged with steel. Another crash followed, closer this time, and Clara felt her pulse thunder in her ears. Silas took position by the window, watching the darkness shift. A figure moved near the barn, then another, shadows creeping with intent. Clara crawled to the base of the wall, heart pounding yet strangely anchored by the memory of Silas's lips on hers. The bandits were testing the fences, circling like wolves. Silas breathed slow, controlled breaths, calculating. The ranch felt fragile for the first time since she'd arrived, but Silas didn't waver. Clara watched him, watched how he shielded her with his presence alone, and the last shards of doubt inside her crumbled. A sudden shout erupted from the yard, then a gunshot split the night. The sound ricocheted through the house, fierce and unforgiving. Silas fired back once, then ducked as a bullet shattered the window frame. Glass rained across the floor, and Clara covered her head instinctively. Silas grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the back door. "We're moving to the cellar," he whispered, voice low but unwavering. She followed, adrenaline flooding her limbs. Outside, shadows lunged closer, voices barking orders. Clara felt fear claw at her throat, but she also felt something stronger, resolve blooming where despair used to live. They reached the cellar door just as another shot cracked through the night. Silas pushed Clara inside, then barred the door behind them. The cellar was dark, lit only by a sliver of moonlight leaking through the floorboards. Clara trembled, but Silas caught her shoulders, anchoring her. "Look at me," he whispered. She lifted her gaze, eyes burning with fear and something fiercer. "This ends tonight," he murmured. The distant footsteps above them thudded, like drums of an incoming storm. Clara held her breath, listening as Silas steadied his rifle and positioned himself near the stairs, ready to defend her with every piece of strength he had left. Then the footsteps stopped. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, waiting for the next move. Clara clung to the edge of the stairs, her pulse thundering. Silas's breath slowed, his focus narrowing to a single point. Above them, the floorboards creaked, softly, deliberately, until the weight of danger felt directly overhead. Clara felt the world tighten around her, every nerve alive with dread and hope intertwined, just as a shadow leaned over the cellar's threshold, and the night braced itself for the choosing of fate.